She will be followed by Nichola Marshall, further to my left. Nichola is a solicitor at a London firm of solicitors called Leigh, who are well known as test case litigators and litigators who do international claims and group actions. And she's been involved in a number of very high-profile litigation against multinational corporations, acting on behalf of Iraqi citizens against the Ministry of Defence, acting against the oil trading company Trafigura on behalf of residents of the Côte d'Ivoire, and also acting on behalf of the survivors of the Mau Mau who suffered torture in the 1950s during the rebellion in the uprising in Kenya against the British colonialists. And she's also been involved in litigation against Shell on behalf of the Ogoni people in the Niger Delta. But that's not really why she's here today. I've told you all that because that's very important litigation that's been going on. But she's recently developed an interest in representing individuals who have suffered sexual or other abuse by UK individuals. She's currently instructed by a group of children in Kenya and Uganda who say that they were sexually abused by a pilot working for British Airways. She's instructed a number of other similar cases in Africa where women and girls have alleged that they were sexually abused by British citizens. She's going to be talking about that. And then finally, on the far left, is Rosa Logar. Rosa is from Vienna. She is here in her capacity as president of Women Against Violence Europe, which itself is a network of European non-government organisations, NGOs, working in the field of combating violence against women and children. She's also the first Vice President of the Council of Europe's group of experts on action against violence against women and domestic violence, and she's a prolific author. She's written articles as well as information, training materials and books discussing the subject of violence against women and against girls. And as I say, she is here in her capacity as President of WAVE, Women Against Violence Europe. So a very distinguished panel of speakers.
All right, thank you very much. Liz, thanks for the introduction. Thank you for inviting Leigh to come and speak. I'm going to give you an insight into a case that we're bringing at the moment and that involves significant issues to do with violence against women. As Liz said, I've been involved in lots of our multi-party group actions, which I've been privileged to be involved in, none of which I will take you through in any detail today because I don't particularly focus on these issues. So let's start with just the International Department of Leigh. Liz has pretty much introduced it, but just so you get the gist. We basically bring civil claims on behalf of individuals in developing countries that have suffered damage or loss. I'm going to talk about damage or loss in a moment. And the cases are brought against British individuals or companies and corporations. The cases are brought in the UK here, so in the High Court in London normally. But the individuals always live overseas, and the investigative work and the research that we do and the meeting with the individuals that we're acting for always happens overseas. So I've been privileged to spend a lot of time in lots of countries and to actually meet people in a real way, not hopping on a plane on a package holiday somewhere. It's been a real privilege today. So damage or loss, just to give you an example of what the sorts of claims that we might bring and what they can include. We talked before about Shell, a case we brought recently against them. That was for environmental pollution. So there we're saying a number of Nigerian fishermen could no longer fish as a result of oils that we say Shell spilled into their waters. And there was a claim for the clean-up of their land and individual losses they had suffered. There's also cases we bring for compensation for personal injuries. So people that have suffered a physical injury. That could be they've been attacked for protesting against a local mine in their community. Maybe they've been shot and suffered gunshot wounds and so on. And other cases include sexual abuse, which is what I'll focus on in a moment. So the damage and loss includes the violence perpetrated against women, but it's not the gist of what we do. It's it's often a factor, and it can be a really subtle factor. So we have to be really careful and live to it, and I'll explain why it's so subtle in a moment. So the case I'm going to talk to you about today is the case we're bringing against British Airways. The man in the pilot's uniform is Simon Wood. He was a former British Airways pilot. I'll tell you about him in a moment. So, just a quick slide on definitions. I don't plan to take you through these. I'm sorry they might not be overly clear, but the reason I'm putting them up there are that is just to highlight the differences. We've got UK definitions as to what violence against women is. We've got a legislative framework that's there. I'm not saying it's necessarily the best we can have. I mean, there's probably sessions over the course of the 2 days that we'll talk about that. But it's there and it's designed to protect, and we know where to look for it and we know how to use it. It doesn't always exist in the same way in many of the countries in which we're working in many of our cases. And it's not necessarily that it doesn't exist legally. There may be legislation there, but the definitions are often very different, and that's a real issue as to how we end up being able to collect evidence and encourage people to want to be able to talk to us and share what's happened to them. So definitions can be much narrower. For example, the definition of what sexual abuse constitutes. It may be in some of the countries we've worked in, it has to be sexual abuse is rape, and that's physical contact as opposed to someone touching someone's breast or touching their bum. And so therefore lots of the communities don't necessarily see some of these issues as sexual abuse, and that therefore means, for one, they don't necessarily speak out about it, but also it's very hard for us when we're trying to collect evidence, and I'll explain that in a moment. So, the case against British Airways. It's referred to as AAA and ABC because the claimants within the case have all got anonymity, so we refer to them by their citers. In gist, Simon Ward was the pilot who was flying for British Airways from about 1999 to 2013. His regular route was to fly to Africa, primarily Kenya and Uganda, and he actively sought out that route. So, as pilots, you often get a choice as to where you want to fly once you qualify for a particular aircraft, but he actively sought out Kenya and Uganda, and there's a reason as to why. Whilst he was in the country, he got a few days down route or on layover, and during that time he would spend time in the British Airways crew hotel, and he'd also spend a lot of time in the communities within a lot of the charitable organisations. Our case against British Airways, we're suing them on behalf of the children that we alleged he sexually abused in orphanages and organisations. And the reason we're bringing a case against British Airways is because we are saying that they're vicariously liable for his actions as his employer. I won't go into a massive amount of detail about that now because it's not the purpose of the talk. But the gist is that he was given the opportunity and the ability to spend time in those organisations and charities because of his role at the airline. So once in the organisations and charities in Kenya and Uganda, he targeted women, single moms, basically. I think of the number of cases we've got, there's probably only one case where the father was on the scene. All of the other cases, there were single moms, utterly impoverished, totally poor. Lots of them were illiterate, and he basically, through his position at the airline, managed to embed himself within families. People saw him as a person that they could trust, and ultimately welcomed him into their homes and their families, and he sort of became quasi-parents. I know it's interesting actually when Rashida was talking before about violence against women often starting in the family, and whilst he wasn't a family member, he was almost like a dad, and some of the girls refer to him as dad, which is quite sad. Okay, so who am I talking about? So at the moment I represent 38 children, one of whom is in the UK, 23 are in Kenya, 14 are in Uganda. The range of abuse ranges from inappropriate touching to rape. It's a real range across. And the typical pattern is the grooming, as I explained before. The aim of our case is to bring a civil claim for them to get them some compensation for the financial loss, and what I mean by that is money that will enable them to hopefully recover. So money for treatment, psychiatric treatment, money to enable them to return to schooling to be disrupted and so on. But also there's a strategic impact to the claims, and that is to trying to put in place safeguards for other organisations that involve employees in charitable work, to make sure that where individuals are vulnerable, they're protected. Okay, so the main challenges that I think that certainly we're facing in this claim, and generally it's because they're women and their children, is firstly obtaining evidence, as I mentioned before. So when you've not got the definitions as to what constitutes sexual abuse, violence or harm, in a sense you're almost educating and talking to communities to say what was happening to that child actually isn't okay, and there is something that we can do about that. And you're often the first person to say that. It's not something that they're necessarily aware of. Also, our psychiatrist, when carrying out psychiatric assessments of them all, has found real difficulties with finding the right language to talk to them and to understand what they're saying about what happened to them. So they haven't necessarily been brought up to talk as a girl about their feelings in the way that we might do here. So, for example, she'd ask them how they might feel after they've been raped, and often the language they'd use is, "I feel bad." And it doesn't conjure up how they must have been feeling. So real challenges with how you then understand that and analyse it, and then you're then able to create a psychiatric diagnosis as a result of what they're telling you. So evidence is a big issue. Then as a result of the sexual abuse, they suffer intersectional discrimination that was touched upon before, and I won't go through it in detail. Lots of you are aware of the various forms, but it's just even more overt because they're a woman and a girl, they're coming into womanhood with their children, and they're viewed very differently within their culture as a result of the abuse. And just to give you a couple of examples from current clients, so you can see the sort of things they're saying, is that the fact they've been abused, the sexual abuse is used against them, so they're viewed as prostitutes. One girl said to our psychiatrist that she was a sinner and a prostitute. She was 17 at the time of the assessment. She was between 13 and 14 when she was raped. She said she stopped wearing dresses because she felt dirty. Another girl, she's 18 at the moment, she was about 16 at the time of the abuse, says that if she wanted to get married now, she's going to have to marry someone outside of her tribe because no one within her tribe would want her. And when she gets married, they'll slaughter a goat in the village, they'll put a cloth into the blood of the goat and she'll have to wear it as an indication to the village that she's not a virgin. So huge issues for them. Secrecy, again, lots of issues around that in the sense of it's not an open society, they can't talk about what's happened to them because as a girl and a woman, they're going to face huge stigma as a result. And just finally, psychiatric treatment. Our hope is to obtain monies for them so they can take part in treatment, but often just taking part in treatment is another form of stigmatisation. If people know locally that they're having treatment, they face further stigma. So just finally, what do we do? What's important for us? So really, as a lawyer, working in different countries, my key issue and what we look for are ways in which we can understand as best possible these issues that are often very subtle that affect women and children, so that we can bring the best possible case for them here in a Western setting when some of these concerns aren't necessarily as apparent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Rosa.
Okay. I get it late, so sorry for that. It's me. I wanted to thank the organizers for inviting me to this conference, and also wanted to congratulate them on their activities and actions to get the so-called Istanbul Convention ratified and signed. Before I go into talking a little bit about the Istanbul Convention and my work there, I wanted to thank Elizabeth for her presentation. I have to say I've been working in this field for a long time, but it was through Elizabeth and Linda and Jean that I became aware how severe the so-called family and private violence is, and how severe the minimalizing is that we are doing, and how this happens under our eyes every day, and how we don't want to see, and how authorities who know or ought to know don't notice. So thank you for this. And also, the Istanbul Convention doesn't talk, unfortunately, about torture. I will do my best to bring this into the work of the committee. So the Istanbul Convention is a European legally binding instrument. It's what Rashida is advocating for globally, has happened in Europe. It's a sort of miracle from my perspective, because it was not easy to get it. I can say that because I was one of the members of the committee who drafted this convention for 2 years. It was a fierce struggle, and many of you are legal scholars or students, so you can see when you analyze the text, you can see where the struggles were, like with all international texts, you can see where the struggles were and the compromises. So one struggle that you can see is a struggle in the scope. If you look at the scope, there's a very interesting thing happening there. I don't know if any of you has looked at the scope more thoroughly. The scope has 3 articles. The first one says that this convention applies to all forms of violence against women, including domestic violence. So this is relatively straightforward. The second paragraph says that the parties are encouraged to apply these provisions also to other victims of domestic violence. Now there's odd that in a legally binding instrument you suddenly have a recommendation. It would take a long time if I tell you all the story that was behind this. Basically, it was a struggle between the people who wanted to have a gender-specific instrument that is encompassing all forms of violence against women, and the people who thought a gender-neutral instrument on domestic violence would be better. Basically, that's what, it's more complex, but that's what was behind it. So why this outcome happened is yet another story, because this has to do with capitalism, because the countries who were some countries who were advocating for a domestic violence gender-neutral convention suddenly noticed that domestic violence is not only men who would be protected, but it's also old people who would have to be protected from neglect, from violence in care, etc. And they noticed that this can be much more challenging and also expensive to protect them all. So that's the reason why it's only a recommendation there. So the money was winning over ideology, I would say. So the third paragraph, very important paragraph, I think, in our times, says that this convention applies in peace and in situation of armed conflicts. There was also a discussion in the committee, because there were people who said, what do we need a women's helpline for if there is a conflict? It's not relevant. Luckily, there were others who said, yes, it is relevant, and especially if there is conflict and armed conflict. There is more violence against women, and we do need a helpline also in these times. So if you're interested, please go and analyze, and there are still people around who know how it happened that you can interview, including me. So I think it's an interesting piece there should be more written about it also, because we can understand also how difficult, although I think it's a great idea to have a global instrument, and I support it, but how difficult it will be to get it. But it shouldn't keep us from doing it, of course. If we look now who has ratified this convention, currently the convention has 19 countries ratified and deposited. Deposited is important because you can have ratified if you haven't deposited yet, it doesn't count. So 19 countries, out of which 12 are EU member states. 20 countries have signed, out of which 13 are EU member states. 8 countries have not signed and ratified yet, out of which 3 are EU member states. Why am I focusing on the EU member states so much? Because there's an interesting development going on. There's a roadmap of the European Commission on the ratification of the Union of the Istanbul Convention. So that's a very interesting development that had not had before, that the Union as a whole would become party of this convention. It will take a while, and it will also depend on more ratifications of the EU countries to make this happen. There are several more on the way, and so it's sort of now speeding up. But there's also still quite a lot of controversy about the convention, and especially some countries struggle with the gendered approach it has. This struggle goes sometimes very far. I remember there were demonstrations in Poland and in Slovakia, also by the church, saying that this convention is very bad and it will do harm to our families and our societies. And they were doing heavy propaganda against ratification and against signature. So it's really terrifying, so to speak, to see that measures, clear analysis that this form of violence has to do something with your gender are becoming so criticized and so distorted also. It's a concerning time that we are in. So, which stage are we in? The Istanbul Convention is in force since August 2014, and it is now being monitored by a committee. It's a committee of 10 experts who have been elected by the parties, by the countries who ratified the convention, and these 10 experts are all women, which I think shows that women are experts in this field. There are some people who are complaining that there should be men also. For now, we have a women-only committee monitoring the Istanbul Convention, and I was elected as one of them for Austria, who has also ratified the convention. What are we doing? We just started our work. We had 2 sessions. I cannot speak here on behalf of Grevio, so I cannot say any opinion of Grevio, but I can say what is being done at the moment, because it's also part of the convention. You can read it there, it's all public. There will be, Grevio will publish reports similar to CEDAW. The first one will be based on a questionnaire. There will be rounds of monitoring, although we haven't decided yet the lengths. The rules of procedures, if you are interested, of Grevio are also public. You can find them on the website of the Council of Europe. So Grevio has made the decision not to determine a length of monitoring, to have more flexibility in its work. The first reports will start to put together in 2016. The countries are not determined yet. That's a big question, always the people asking who will be first. There's no decision about that made, so we have to see how that works out. It's a new committee that has also to get into its role, has to learn from others, and has to include all the wisdom that there is. Grevio will seek information from non-governmental organizations and civil society, as well as from national institutes, and will take due consideration of the existing data collection and research, and of existing information available. I think that's a very, very important part, that we have have to look at what has been done before, what Rashida has been doing in her reports, what other human rights bodies have been finding out, and to create synergies between these knowledge, and not to start all over again. I think that will be the big issue for the next years in general, in all human rights area maybe, but especially also in the area of women's human rights, that we need to create synergies between the different instruments that are there. So I guess my 3 minutes are only 1 minute now, or even less. So the monitoring, I don't have to go into detail also because you can all read it find it on the website. Here is the website of the review committee. One thing maybe at the end, the committee can also start special inquiries if there is reliable information indicating the situation where problems require immediate attention. We can ask for an urgent submission of a special report and conduct a special inquiry. So that's a special instrument that the committee has available for more serious violations of the measures and provisions under the Convention. Thank you.
Rosa, thank you very much indeed, and thank you for sticking to time. What I plan to do now, we've got about 10 minutes, so I think we could take another round of 3 questions and have the panellists, including Rashida, respond to them. And then I'm going to ask Thomas Schmidt from European Lawyers for Democracy and Human Rights to speak to the appeal for the ratification and implementation of the Istanbul Convention. We'll then have a break, but we've then got timetabled, I think it's 15 minutes of open house. So those of you who are burning either to make points or to make questions, you can do it then as well. And then we have another panel session, which would also include some time for questions. So I think we still do have enough time for enough points and participation from the audience. I'm aware that there's been a lot of speaking. So can I see 3 hands? And what would be helpful is if you could direct your question to one of the individual speakers and say which one it is, and then I'm not suggesting that each of our 4 speakers answers each 3 questions, but any directed questions and they will answer. So I'm going to take, there was a sister at the back, I thought, maybe not, no? Sister, yes, sister at the back, sister here in red, and sister there towards the back, yes. Yes.
Hi there. Just a general question really around the potential link between the SDG or the New Development Framework and because it's a universal framework, so there's clearly an obligation on states to think through how they're going to address violence against women and girls, and whether that may have an impact on the ratification of something like the Istanbul Convention.
And that's addressed to Rosa, is it?
To Rashida and to, sorry, I didn't catch the last speaker's name.
Rashida and Rosa,
Yeah.
okay.
Thank you.
So that's because you're making note.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Madalena Santos from Portugal. And my question is also to Rose. Thank you for your work, first time. And Portugal was the first European country that ratifies the Convention of Istanbul. And in the Commission, in the workshop this morning, we were talking about this. And one of the problems that we have in Portugal is how to measure the impact of the convention. So I want to say to you that we are going to work a lot together because my movement, the Portuguese Association of Democratic Lawyers, is going to have several actions in the government and not fighting and discussing all about this, because we implemented some of the articles, but we don't know the results of that implementation. And we want to measure that because we think in Portugal that the most important thing is to have a political commitment on all that measures. If there is no political commitment, and if the women have not the means and to be free as economical, political, culture, and so on, they cannot be free. So the instrument exists, but the ways to implement that articles are not well done in Portugal. So that's our point now, is how to implement effectively those articles and to measure the politicals and the results of that implementation. Thank you so much for your work. We are going to work together in Portugal.
And up there, yeah.
Thank you very much to all of you. That was very, very interesting and important. I have 3 small questions. Just one.
I'll do a deal too. If there's more.
Okay. So, first of all, I've been working a lot on litigation against state actors and non-state actors for sexual and gender-based violence. So I have a question to Nichola, very precisely. How did you gather the evidence? Because our experience was that it's so hard to get out there and to get the one speak. So I would be interested by that. And Rosa, you were saying that Germany is on a good way to ratify the convention. I'm a little bit afraid because at the moment it's really not in line with our sexual criminal code. So they will violating the convention. So I really would like to know why you think it's on the way. And Manju, I think it's great that we are asking for a legal binding treaty. But don't you also think there's so much important stuff out there, like CEDAW and the Rome Statute and the new gender policy paper? Don't you think that's also important that we as lawyers use the arguments in our national strategic litigation? I would like to lobby for that a bit.
Okay, so Rosa, Nichola, and then Rashida, if you would.
I would like to answer to the sister from Portugal. Thank you. It's wonderful also to be here with all of you and to see how enthusiastic and engaged you are. We need the activists and the lawyers. We need lawyers because we need litigation, and that would be one of my answers also to my Portuguese sisters. I would say data, because numbers can be power. It's one, and litigation. We need to bring more cases to the European Court of Human Rights. There are already, it's starting, there are some cases now on violence against women and domestic violence. And there is this starting jurisprudence on the concept of due diligence that Rashida has also been talking about, which is very interesting and the court is very eager, it seems, but we need to move that forward and we have to make that more public, especially also on a national level. These rulings are not known and are not used, and sometimes there is resistance to do that, but that's very important. And we have the advocates for the survivors, for instance, in our organizations. We have the evidence. I mean, if we work together, we can bring these cases to the court. I think more litigation, and I really hope for all your engaged work in this area. And as I said, the data, we need to challenge our administrations, governments to produce more and clearer data. We need to see, for instance, how much resources, how much money do they spend on the prevention of violence against women and domestic violence. And we know that there is a serious underfunding, but we want to see how big the underfunding is. So we have to press them. We now as NGOs, I'm not talking as Grevio yet, also I hope that Grevio will also take this route of getting clear indicators, concrete indicators to measure. And Germany, I was hoping that you would make a new law on rape that would comply with the convention and then ratify quickly. Because they have wonderful organizations and groups who are working for that.
Yeah, but it's not going to happen. They just stopped it.
Oh,
they just
that's bad to hear. So we have to...
You have to
Okay. All right. Thank you. Nichola.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks for your question about evidence. I think in the case I talked to you about, the British Airways case, it's very different. It's quite unique because we were actually invited in to meet with the communities and the children and families by an NGO that was working on the ground out there. So they were already appraised of the issue, so that made it a really easy introduction for us. And it was then about us establishing relationships with the NGO and then with the communities so that they could trust us as lawyers and open up to us about what happened to them and their children. And there's no real opposition in that case. It's not that the local government or the police are cross about what we're doing, which is quite a fortunate position, I guess, that we're in there, and in lots of our other cases that isn't apparent. But the real key in that case was getting the testimony from the children, and mainly, not least because some of them were very young, but they sort of range between maybe 5 to 17 or 18, but mainly because they just didn't have this concept that necessarily everything that had been done to them was wrong. They didn't like it, they felt uncomfortable about it, but they didn't see it in the way that we would view it and understand that something could be done about it. So that was the main challenge.
And Rashida.
Thank you. I have a question for Nichola about cultural competency. Do you use local people? Because you spoke about the language, you spoke about not being able to articulate in the way that you would want for your evidence. I mean, the term defilement gets used in a lot of legislation in African countries. And, defilement on the face of it is about any kind of sexual activity, but the consequences of that for women and girls are huge in these countries. I'm glad I've never contributed to British Airways when they come around those little packets on the plane. The Sustainable Development Goals and Violence Against Women link, well, unfortunately, I argued in a submission to the working group on the SDGs that there should be a standalone goal on violence against women, considering that it's the most pervasive human rights violation that we face today. But it's a political process of developing these goals and articulating the language. And so what we have is we have a goal on women's rights and gender equality and a target on violence against women. It's more than existed in the previous development goals, the MDGs. I'm not sure that makes it better just because we have better language in the new development goals. I think it's about how do we give life to that and hold states accountable. The second question was that in terms of the soft law that emanates from the United Nations, I think it's a great idea if more and more lawyers used it in influencing the development of legislation at the national level. But my position was a global position, so the issue of universality of human rights demands that I look outside of the box of a national perspective. I also see that the universalization of the human rights of women is important because it does serve an educated process. But more importantly, we have international accountability, which for me is really important in terms of state responsibility. I think that, and it was Jackie Jones who said this to me once, sometimes there are comments made, but we have the Istanbul, we have this. And my response always to the Istanbul Convention is, Europe is not the world. If Germany has something, Germany is not the world. And I think we need to look outside as lawyers, whether we work at a national or international level. We need to look outside. We need to, if we believe in the universality of human rights, we do need to look outside that box.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. And now can I ask Thomas Smith to come to the PowerPoint, please? Thank you very much. Before I introduce Thomas, I've been asked to confirm what Grevio, which Rosa has been speaking about, stands for, and it is the Group of Experts on Action Against Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence. So I hope that's helpful. Thomas is